The terrorist campaign in overthrowing the United States government and targeting David Bowles established the estimate of the military intelligence for his character processed by the Confederacy, writing the war warrants, at which point you have the assumption where the estimate derives the birth being irrelevant to the creation of the legal character, qualifying the market surrounding the estimate over the legal character, at which point the assumption that David would stop the crash of '08 is fundamental to the person, which is qualified to the developed resources, which earned the ability to save Europe on maturity according to the contracted schedule, at which point you have the preparations of the market for David's character, at which point you have the facilitation, which exceeds the market going back before the 60s, in the 50s. I'm not sure when the Nazis would have started generating the specific strategies, at which point the concealed strategies of the creation of the Nazis, such as Smedley Butler's rejection of the Nazi overthrow of the United States, would have been similar in timing, at which point they would have had the many contingencies to overthrowing the United States, qualifying the definition of their interest in the military intelligence in the strategies in the War on David, qualifying the market's starting points from that secret origin of their strategies in overthrowing the United States by the infiltration of the United States government in systematic overthrow over its functions, at which point you have the stacking functions, which generates their infiltration of the FBI and intelligence apparatus in general, which was used in order to compromise and infiltrate and gain allies by extortion, which includes Ronald Reagan, who was a part of a conspiracy for the fascist overthrow of the United States by the use of military against the civilian population for the enforcement of the fascist powers in question, at which point the use of secrecy for the use of the surveillance power is a Nazi strategy against the United States, which was generated by the Confederacy and its division of Druids, which engage in the creation of the Nazism, dividing them from the KKK Confederates, at which point you have the multi-layer Druid system from this arrangement, which fundamentally does not detract from the fact that they are the same group, but are variations of the same group. They are denominations in the same religion, at which point you have the expression of their function in infiltrating of the United States and the use of its equipment against the American population as a function of KKK terrorism, which is the oppressive act of war against civilians without cause or due process, qualifying their systematic policies specifically crafted for the express purpose of destroying the United States and overthrowing the civilian government in favor of the Nazi insurgency, at which point you have the express destruction of the United States by the destabilizing of the market, which specifically attacks the market in preparations for David's character, which qualifies our conversation on the definition of David in the market, at which point we have acknowledged from the records, from what could be discovered, that there would have been two pseudo-famous black bankers who would have been sent to David in order to change from banking into a brokerage, at which point, with the proper representation in general norms, if the Americans had been in control and had protected the system, these markets would have been manufactured originally without the disruption, at which point you would have had to have protected them in order to have not committed the crime against David. By the preparations are essential to the starting assets for David, at which point David is not a person or a physical body. David is the qualifier of the legal title and the estimate of his economic exchanges and national exchanges and political exchanges for the qualifying of the starting of the constitutional kingdom as a new country under his control, which is the brokerage nation which saves Europe from their estimates. At which point you have the horoscope, which defines the definitions of the primary interest of the characters, at which point their investments projecting the success or failure for their ability to profit off of the margins assumes the character from the horoscope as the way of earning the margins, at which point their defense of their profits is their predictions, is their reliance upon the horoscope, at which point David is compelled or influenced in the direction of accepting the horoscope as a correct answer, as the alignment would make the investors happier for better influence, which allows them to have higher profiting, at which point, as the constitutional kingdom at the point of birth, the only thing that could change the agreements and customs and policies and laws of the kingdom would be the king, at which point David would be the only one who would be able to change the schedule or the projections or the mechanism of reliable systems in place which would generate the margins in question, qualifying the development of the system, at which point you have the system's primary focus around the supermodels, which are his starting associations, qualifying his original culture as being led by adult, highly attractive, highly successful women, influencing David as a child, which is the original culture, which is the legal culture. The obstruction of the value is a criminal act and cannot negate from the original status or original value, as it is a fascist terrorist qualifier asserting the ability to destroy the United States, at which point you must ignore it in American law in favor of the protection against the human trafficking and its criminal change of status, at which point you have the forming of the brokerage, which evolves into the brokering of business contracts, movies, TV, pumpkin spice, Christmas presents, and all of the rest of these functions, which are the systems of delivering wholesale to resale on majority of the assumptions, at which point you have the function of it trading the acts of the businesses and the acts of the retail selling to the specific customers in question, stabilizes itself by the function of the exchange on the wholesale under the brokerage, at which point the pre-purchase of the definitions of the account holder customers purchasing from the retailers would be in the brokerage, which would incentivize the wholesale purchase on the prediction or the speculation from the promises to purchase the definitions, at which point you have the forming of the definition account inside the brokerage, which is the position of what anyone wants when engaging in the trade, at which point you have the purchase of the product, which is the brokerage seeking out to form the specific thing from nothing, at which point they broker the arrangement of it being spontaneously manufactured, at which point you have the system of speculation and its higher grade success on the basis of it having already been purchased through the credits, at which point the credit card, having already spent for the product, has the obligation of delivery with all of the insurances in question, at which points you have the function of the the wholesale delivery to the companies making the products in question, at which point the talent in the companies would be writing the definition on how they want to construct their specific mechanism, which is the delivery of services in supplementing to their companies, at which point their cost of work productions qualifies the definition aspect of them writing that, at which point you have examples like Henry Cavill in The Witcher, who would have actively written the definition to be brokered that The Witcher rely exclusively on the source material, at which point the definition would have to be respected in order for the trade to be processed correctly, at which point any diversion from the core definition is a subversion of having brokered the arrangement, qualifying the obligation of purchasing the property in question, and restarting it under the agreed definition, which is the purchased product, which is the obligation of the brokers to deliver, as it is a paid service, qualifying the arrangements of the market maintaining itself as a true free system, at which point you have the function of the high-grade talent inside the various functions. Now, in our example of Henry Cavill, who would have made in those original agreements from the brokerage, have the obligation to attach to the product in his credit score, at which point he isn't a hired employee from the agreement or subcontractor from the agreement. He would be a co-owner of the agreement, at which point the success or failure of the product in question would directly relate to his credit score, which would influence his general status, which generates how often or how much he would get paid for the high-grade questions, at which point higher risk creates higher rewards, at which point the position of their acceleration in the high-grade status would be based upon their efforts, which would neutralize the sexist subversions in many of the corporate exchanges, at which point it being specifically attached to it as an account holder would subvert many of the power dynamics, which has historically been subversive against women and minorities and other groups, at which point you have the arrangement to subvert the development of the Confederate wizard market, which has the ability to engage in the influence of the position, at which point the concept has to move over back into the original position with Mattis's character as a peer general to David's character. Mattis wanted to suppress David and destroy all of his market functions, at which point the unnecessary force of their terrorist exchange against him is based upon their racist unwillingness to pay the value owed specifically to David, at which point you have the aggressive suppression of his contracts and status, at which point any misrepresentation of David is an act of defamation, but any representation of David is misrepresenting him under the position that they are engaged in the bait and switch to engage in the framing of the changing of the system mechanisms in question, at which point if you have a mechanism of a scale that goes up to 100, the scale at 100 at the 5 different resources necessary would generate the equal weight at the 100, but if you reduce that to 40, for instance, then that massive reduction, if you keep all of one resource representing it correctly, then the resource of the equal 1/5 at the 100 is not an equal 1/5 at the 40, at which point you have the demonstration of it being fundamentally unbalanced and compromising, qualifying the misrepresentation as a function of defamation, at which point their fundamental targeting of David on the basis of his sexuality in question for their position of defamation so that they could replace his sexuality with their desired sexuality, similar to how they are targeting homosexuals and trans, at which point their secret abuses against them puts them in a position where the reality of the situation is that they are physically in danger and it is happening to them, at which point they say that God's doing this to me. If God did it, then how could it be wrong? The position is actually that it's a false pseudoscience experiment, at which point the position of the manipulation is abused by the government, at which point they are perfectly innocent in the position that they are being assaulted, at which point the thing that they're trying to be defamed with from the criminal injury is them being criminally abused, at which point the position of substantive due process, which is the government not being allowed into the home or into the bedroom, qualifies their position as protected from being targeted by the thing that's changing them into the other thing, at which point they would no longer be homosexual if they were safe and secure inside their own bedroom. Without the government involved in the manipulation, there is no change, and they would revert back to their original minus permanent injuries, at which point you have the position of the interest of whatever the sexual harassment campaign is, at which point whatever they sexually harassing the target with, they are guilty of, as it is criminal intention of them to create the thing that they are sexually harassing the person on, at which point you have the development of the active suppression of the sexuality, at which point you have the estimate for David's character, which before the suppression was estimated at the 6-inch dick and the I think it was 6.4 feet tall, before the growth suppressors and poisons of various kinds would have been applied, at which point the systematic use of human trafficking for the abuses and the poisons and the subversions and the suppressions generates the massive reduction of the position, which was originally assumed to be hypermasculinity, as to be able to perform at the 100% highest grade function as the patriarchy, qualifying the higher form of resources and the higher quantities of the resources in question generate the 100% compared to the suppressed 40%, generating a higher overflow of the resources which were necessary to the correct balances, at which point everything looks out of place because everything is put out of place by a function of a terrorist act of war by these Confederate insurrectionists, at which point you have the development of these types of examples which specifically tell you the mechanism of their substantive change of the society by the use of fraud and secrets, qualifying the defense of their terrorist subversion against the civilian government in favor of the procedure of the KKK terrorism campaigns, at which point the courts of the KKK terrorists, or the secret courts of the former King of England, which was a part of, I think it was the Declaration of Independence, which covers many of the abuses of the former king, at which point this would have infiltrated into the function of the reproduction of their new position seeking the generation of a king, at which point the position for George Washington, having been suggested originally with the possibility of becoming king and him specifically rejecting it for the limitations of the term limits for the 4 years in question, would qualify the rejection of the unitary executive theory, which is the function of claiming that the president is a pseudo-elected king, at which point the creation of the pseudo-elected king with their subversion of the mechanism of the republic in question through the voter fraud systematically would position them into the wizard terrorism of secretly replacing the votes through KKK terrorists loyal to the subversion, engaging in the voter fraud for the substantive changes of who is elected in question, making it a false vote as a fraudulent series of votes. You have a alternative to the popular government, at which point there is no rule of law and there is no popular government, at which point their fundamental core hated enemy is the constitutional republic of these United States, qualifying the core motive of their terrorism in the overthrowing of America and the world for their fascist dictates, at which point the relationship mixes in the infiltrations of the communists, at which point they would be mostly fascist and a little bit communist, which then is paired and mirrored by the Chinese Communist Party, which is mostly communist and a little bit fascist, at which point you have the relationship built upon the yin and yang relationship between the Chinese and the Confederacy, at which point you have the developed conspiracies in the tyrannical abuses against the United States and the world by the function of the development of tyrannical and abusive equipment of the government secretly used as acts of war against civilian populations, at which point the war crimes of the occupying military force engaging in the pseudoscience and fraudulent exchanges in order to defraud the courts is their functional core religion in the function and duties of their reliable nation in all of its practical applications. as it is fundamentally important to understand that their consistent interest has included their systematic assaults through their surveillance terrorism, which purges the position of the house, at which point you have the infiltration of the house and you have the infiltration of the bedroom, at which point you have a system of human trafficking by non-touch surveillance mechanisms, which engages in the indirect use of a gun, which generates a signal which hacks the nerves and engages in physical changes upon the body from the use of the subversion, such as their technology for heat rays, which have the ability to engage in the hyper increasing of the temperature of the target, at which point you have other technologies with specific interest in question, at which point all of them are designed to conduct their own functional advantage, at which point there are different subjects, including the use of compelled actions. They can make you speak, they can make you cry, they can make you scream, they can make you fart, they can make you shit yourself, they can make you pee yourself, they can remove all control over bodily function, at which point they have the ability to exponentially compound the function of terrorism for the function of the implementation of criminal pain, which generates the position of permanent injuries, at which point their position of attacking on the basis of engaging in their threats of violence and application of violence for the purpose of their hate group activities is the qualifier of them, the KKK, in their hate group terrorist campaigns, subverting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to be secure in your person, your papers, and your effects, at which point there is no security to any target at any point, including the president, who they would have actively targeted, at which point you have many campaigns of the demonstration in the public sphere of insulting the targets of being unfit for service or unfit for duty on the basis of them being assaulted by the terrorist subversion from the surveillance secret attacks, which would be the position of defamations compounded upon real life criminal terrorist attacks for permanent injuries, at which points you have those permanent subversions which create the embarrassment thing and subject in question, which would generate their flubs and their misspeeches, and the position is not that they're unfit for service, but they are being disabled by a terrorist attack by the KKK terrorist loyal Confederates inside the United States government. At which point these technologies have been experimented throughout society against civilians and government agents, including the position of many of their neutering campaigns with the military, where they inject various things which sterilizes the soldiers, at which points there have been some reports of this, but I don't have lots of copies, at which point I can't verify it beyond the copies that I would have been told but don't have the ability of reproducing, at which point I can't really use it as a source material, except for acknowledging that I have in fact digested the reports in question, at which point you have these subversions which generate their population control mechanisms, which is the mass extermination of all outside hate group. Being outside of the hate group qualifies you as the enemy, at which point they would have many people who they would be actively deceiving into compliance with the hate group tactics, at which point you have the kiting of each outside group against each other and the misrepresentation of the concept that you are a part of their group, at which point you have the false affirmation of their hate group, which would generate the position of compliance without the delivery of the product of the value, which is the function of dark psychology. And the activity of the dark psychology is the least amount of good in order to generate the most amount of evil against the targets in question, at which point you have maximum compliance with the least amount of the delivery of the products, at which point you have the extortion mechanism, which is generated by their systematic abuses and the lesser two evil negotiations. At which point you have the functional trap, which is systematically placed against them. At which point, the most important thing to understand is when you dance, it won't create rain. The rain dance is a famous Indian dance, but it's functionally irrelevant to the weather. And it doesn't matter, likewise, with the terrorist hate group, what you do or how you behave. Your dance, however that might be interpreted, will never change the functional conditions and delivery of the products of these malicious Satanist freaks. At which point you have the systematic compounding frauds of the larger traps generating the position of their permanent suppression and abuses, qualifying their intentional submission to their own suicide on the basis of being hillbilly, backwater, uneducated losers who were hated by their parents too much to have been taught to have not been victims of these criminal enterprises. These terrorist subversions in question can be explained with the assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan, who was shot under the position from the Project Monarch and MK Ultra and other mechanisms which could culminate in a secret arrangement, at which point I can't tell you the exact systems which would have been a part of him being shot, but he was betrayed by the fascists who never had the position of compliance with the American government, at which point the false sale to those being entrapped is that you're one of us, at which point you realize that you're not once you're bleeding on the ground like a dumbass schmuck who fell for a basic ass bitch con, qualifying the system of their perpetual harassments of the legitimate government in question in order to gain compliance, at which point members of the government at every level would be harassed into compliance. The military, the CIA, the president would actively be assaulted and harassed and defamed and compromised into these systems which are specifically designed to demonstrate that the KKK is the only authority. And since power is the only authority, then the function of being legitimately a part of the government, having earned every aspect of it, would be irrelevant to that access and function, as the Nazis in question would have completely no respect or obligation to subjugate themselves to the rule of law, to the Constitution, and thus not to the Republic, and thus the authority of the Republic, though you be the president, is irrelevant to the United States enemies who have captured its equipment and leveraged against it in order to engage in the function of their KKK terrorist plans, at which point the function of the Confederacy using the American equipment would be unchallenged by their use of their threats of violence against the lawful members of the government who are subverted in the Catch-22 subversion of they are stuck in a position where they are fully vulnerable, at which point they are fully subject to the complete and total malicious extortion of their office, which they are abused into not being loyal to in function, at which point you have the systematic replacing of the United States government with the Confederacy, which engages in their relationship with the Europeans and the use of the attempt to engage in the Great Reset, at which point you have the collapse of Europe after the Great Reset, which would subjugate the Europeans to the Confederacy, at which point the hatred of the non-Confederate peoples would engage in the systematic abuses and extortions and excessive prices and abuses and robberies and murders of those peoples in question who have been fully subjugated at that point when it reaches maturity to their Nazi enemies, at which point you have the system of them falling into the same con of their parents not loving them enough to not teach them how to not be a dumbass 24/7, which is the prerequisite of them having gotten this bad in the war on David, at which point the position of the rejection of the solution of David Bowles as a legal character is the qualifier of their parents having not loved them enough to have not been systematically entrapped into their own systematic death machine, qualifying the hatred of by their parents, who view them with complete spite and tremendous horror at the qualifying possibility that these dumb terrorist scum were even allowed to be born, and thus the maturity of these idiots who were taught wrong on purpose is the legitimate proof that they should be scorned with every single mechanism, qualifying the position that if they weren't that dumb, they wouldn't have fallen for it. Every vulnerability against David's character and person and effects qualifies their systematic entrenching defects in subjugation to their own personal injury, at which point you have the systematic terrorist compounding efforts of the international conspiracies against David against their own safety to their enslavement and destruction, as their willful suicide bombings makes them suicide terrorists, which is their fundamental core nature as legally insane. At which point you have the systematic support of the criminal terrorist enterprise in their war against David, qualifying the malicious suppression for defamation and permanent injury as a reaction of the permanent defamation in the malicious suppression of his human decency and status, qualifying the prevention of his access to the due diligence which is owed to him in discovery, qualifying his ability to have been able to relieved himself of these criminal injuries which he is currently subject to, qualifying the restoration of their security, qualifying the restoration of their safety, qualifying the restoration of their prosperity, which is the natural outcome of the lawful economy when they are forced to be rational, competent, stable, and planning towards the future, at which point their foresights into planning for the future qualifies their strategies on a competent, stable development, certifies David's permanent mechanism of collecting commissions off of that competent foresight, at which point you have the systems which systematically function as the payment structure towards David, funding him from his original contracts, which are currently being criminally suppressed to the point where he cannot even engage in his basic trading at the lowest level, qualifying the complete eradication of all resources, qualifying the system of malicious suppression and starvation, as the dwindling resources qualify as an act of murder because the purpose of the function is the prevention of the possibility of living as a direct reaction of having been born, and the crime of having been born generates the things that David's character is actually guilty of: race, status, and office. He is a general in the United States military, in the new branch of the military, overseeing the intelligence apparatus, which is a specific subversion of the Confederate loyalties against the American Republic. That is verifiably true from their projections. The military intelligence is 100% accurate on that. David was born his own race. He is his own culture in the development of the creation of the new country, which is the certification of his oversight as the patriarchy over that culture, qualifying that culture being erased from history as an act of genocide. Yes, he is 100% undeniably guilty of being his race. And then you have the status generated by his original profits from his lawful owed contracts, at which point his engagement in the free economy being essential to the national security from the military intelligence, qualifying his systems, networks, and insurances, protecting the economy from collapse, thus the subjugation of the oppression against the American population on the basis of them being economically destabilized without the insurance in question, qualifies Davis' status from the military intelligence as the thing he's being fully convicted of, at which point there's no denying any of it. It's 100% true. They are actually 100% undeniably and unironically correct. David is their better in every conceivable way, and these sniveling bitch-ass pussies are maliciously intoxicated with hating him for proving their natural inferiority in their system of destroying the inferiors.